Hello, and welcome to Badger Talks Live, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. I am Kim Norscher, a PhD candidate in the Van Oss Lab in the Department of Animal and Dairy Sciences. I'm originally from Carrollton, Texas, and over the past few years at UW, I've been studying the interactions between social contact and thermal stress, specifically heat and cold, in pair-housed calves, as well as adult cow ventilation and heat abatement strategies. During the month of July, Badger Talks Live is proud to showcase the latest UW research around sustainability in our state. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jennifer Van Oss, Assistant Professor and Extension Specialist in Animal Welfare, and Dr. Erin Lashnits, a Clinical Assistant Professor of Small Animal Internal Medicine. Today, they will be talking about the latest research about the implications of heat stress and climate change for the welfare of animals. The research in the Van Oss Lab at the UW-Madison focuses on understanding, evaluating, and improving the welfare of dairy animals from biological and social science perspectives. The goal of Jennifer's extension program is to promote the best practices in management and housing to help the dairy industry adapt as our scientific knowledge about animal welfare continues to grow. She received her PhD in the interdisciplinary animal behavior graduate program at the University of California, Davis, and conducted a postdoctoral research in the animal welfare program at the University of British Columbia. Erin's broad research interest is in infectious disease epidemiology using a One Health context, particularly studying zoonotic and vector-borne diseases and infectious diseases that impact underserved veterinary populations. Current studies include characterizations of the flea microbiome and flea-borne diseases and flea roaming cats and investigating Bartonella species transmission. She received her MS in biology from Stanford University, DVM from Cornell University, and PhD in comparative biomedical sciences from NCSU. Jennifer and Erin will be answering questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to post them in the chat at any point. Please welcome Erin Lashnits.
Hello, everyone. My name is Erin Lashnitz. I'm a veterinarian specializing in small animal internal medicine. Dog and cat infectious diseases mainly. And I'm also assistant professor here at the UW Vet School. So as Kim said, I study vector-borne disease, the type of diseases spread by insects like fleas and ticks. And I study those diseases in pets and in people using epidemiology, disease ecology, and through what we call One Health, which is really basically trying to keep the big picture of how health, both human health and pet health, is influenced by the environment we all live in. So we know that climate change is a concern for pet owners really across the globe, as well as locally here in Wisconsin. While my research focuses on vector-borne diseases, and I'll give you some examples of how climate change might be impacting the vector-borne diseases that affect dogs and cats, there are also other impacts that climate change can have on pets. And so I'll touch on a few of those examples at the end as well. So then when it comes to the interplay of vectors in the environment, how warming or changing climate conditions will impact ticks or fleas and their behavior, and therefore their ability to spread pathogens, all of that is really a pretty open question. We know a lot more about it in diseases that affect people than that affect cats and dogs, for sure. But we do know that the changing ecology, the changing ecological niches available to the vectors of disease are not determined solely by local weather patterns or even solely by climate. There are lots of other factors that impact the distribution of vector-borne diseases and other zoonotic diseases that can spill over into pets and people. And those things are intimately associated with things like climate change, but not necessarily climate per se. So those include things like wildlife, expanding and changing ranges of wildlife and changing behavior of wildlife mean that different wildlife species interact with new and unfamiliar species and might allow for the spillover of pathogens into new populations and even for pathogen mutation. Things like our changing use of the land. increasing intensive agriculture, different changes to urbanization. This, again, can change the way that humans and pets interact with the wildlife and the land, and it's definitely impacted by climate change. And then the pathogens themselves. So evolutionary pressures on the pathogens may change the pathogenicity or the transmissibility of certain organisms. And all of these interactions and potential impacts are definitely more so studied in people, less so in pets, but that's really what my research is designed to look at. And I've mentioned this idea of spillover a couple of times. Spillover, the idea of transmission of a disease from an animal population into people. This has even entered into popular consciousness now because of COVID. There's a lot of research showing that SARS-CoV-2 originated as a spillover from an animal reservoir into humans before the now widespread human-to-human transmission. So actually, UC Davis has created a web tool that analyzes the factors that create a high risk of spillover for these viruses. And they've discovered that many of the environmental factors that play into those calculations, the factors that make something a high risk for viral spillover, are expected to change in a warming climate. So all of that said, all of these complicated factors playing together, I'll give some specific examples of vector-borne diseases in pets that are showing changes in relationship to these factors right here at home in the US and in Wisconsin as well. The first vector, the first insect that spreads disease that I'll talk about is the mosquito. Because of warming and changing rainfall patterns, the distribution and activity of mosquitoes is expected to change. And estimates are that maybe 500 million more people will be exposed to disease-carrying mosquitoes in the next 30 years. This is clearly a concern for humans. Malaria, yellow fever, West Nile, there are a lot of scary diseases that mosquitoes transmit to people. But with those 500 million people, there are also a lot of cats and dogs. Internationally, we know that there are a number of mosquito-borne diseases that can affect cats and dogs. But here in the US, our biggest concern is heartworm disease. Heartworm disease, this is a picture of a heart from a dog that had heartworm disease. And you can actually see the little bean sprout looking things inside of that heart are the heartworms. They live in the heart, the main pulmonary artery. And as you might imagine, if you have a lot of worms living in your heart, it can be a really severe and often fatal disease without treatment. With climate change, with global warming, heartworm has spread from being more of a tropical disease in the US, confined to really the Southeast, to now being found all across the entire country. To the point where about 10 years ago in 2010, the American Heartworm Society is now recommending year-round heartworm prevention for all dogs. And that's because they've really seen an increase in transmission, particularly in the off-season, so the winter, when you wouldn't necessarily expect mosquitoes to be transmitting disease. But in a lot of parts of the US, the mosquitoes really aren't dying off as much in the winter as they used to. So they're recommending to keep all of our dogs on heartworm preventative year-round. Mosquitoes aren't the only vector of disease we have to worry about, and that are spreading and moving north as the climate warms. So the range of ticks is spreading. This is bringing unfamiliar tick-borne diseases into new locations across the country and into Canada, where they really haven't had to deal with it before. The Lone Star tick is one such example. So this tick was historically confined really to the Southeast, the Ozarks, but it's now expanding north and west in where it really hadn't been seen previously. And this is potentially being helped by milder winters, changes to rainfall pattern, that kind of thing. Now, the biggest concern with the Lone Star tick for some people, it will be that it's the tick that's reported to cause the red meat allergy, although that does appear to be pretty rare. While it would be really bad for our dogs and cats to develop an allergy to red meat, it really hasn't yet been reported in pets. But the Lone Star tick does carry diseases that I think can be even scarier for our pets. So there's one disease in particular, which affects cats, and that is called cytosomosis, or Cytox for short, since it's a really long word. Cytox is a really severe, often fatal disease that can actually kill cats within just a few days of when they first get sick. And with the vector of the Lone Star tick, it is more often seen in the Southeast. When I practiced in North Carolina, we did see it all the time. Here in Wisconsin, we do not, fortunately, yet. And so this is a slide that I showed the vet students who haven't often seen a case of Cytox here in Wisconsin. When cats get infected, they get jaundiced, so their skin turns yellow like a highlighter. They develop a really high fever, so even their owners can often notice that they're hot to the touch. And then usually once they get to the vet, they have some blood work abnormalities. So the most common one is where the blood cell that helps them clot gets overactivated and clumps up. That's the platelets, and that gives them something called thrombocytopenia. So this presentation of disease is in endemic areas for Cytox is very suspicious for a Cytox infection. And while this disease used to be nearly always fatal, fortunately, there's now a course of treatment that we can give to cats. And it can save anywhere from maybe half to 3/4 of cats. If you catch it earlier, the earlier you start treating, the more likelihood you have of saving these cats. And so it is really important to know where the disease itself exists and where the tick that spreads it, therefore, actually exists. So fortunately, we get to put these cats back to their happy, healthy selves after treatment often. This map here shows that this tick, the Lone Star tick, actually does exist and can occasionally be found in Wisconsin. So the red are counties where it's been reported. The green are counties where multiple different life stages of this tick have been reported. So even though the map I showed earlier, this little guy, shows just like a little titchy edge coming into Wisconsin, we actually are seeing the occasional Lone Star tick throughout the state here. Now that's the vector for this disease. And then we also have to think about whether the pathogen exists here and the different behavior of the pathogen as well. So you can see this map here shows states in blue where Cytox has been reported in cats. And so you can see while Wisconsin is still gray, Illinois is blue. And so I do think it may only be a matter of time until we start to see this disease here in Wisconsin as climate change makes Wisconsin more and more hospitable for the tick and the pathogen itself. Moving on from the Lone Star tick to Lyme disease, probably the most well-known tick-borne disease in the US. It's pretty well established that urbanization and other changes to the landscape and environment brought about by people can be implicated in the resurgence of Lyme starting in about the 1970s. We know that in lots of areas, particularly in the Northeast, people began to move from their farms to these like nice green leafy suburbs. And with the expansion of these neighborhoods into the surrounding wooded areas, these woods fragmented. And the natural predators of the reservoirs of Lyme, the deer and the mice, they decreased, allowing the populations of the reservoirs to increase. So in these nice new suburbs, people, and in fact their dogs, began to spend time in these really tick-infested areas, coming into a lot of contact with the ticks and the Lyme that they were carrying. This graphic that I'll show illustrates cases of human Lyme that have been reported to the CDC over about the past 20 years. So it starts in 2001 and gives a visual on how it's been moving over time and how quickly it's been moving over time. So you can see each increment is a year. And you can watch it expand sort of through the Northeast, this focus in the Midwest, definitely in Wisconsin, and how quickly it has changed. So undoubtedly, the drivers of Lyme emergence and spread over the past 50 years are pretty complicated. It's a really complicated and very interesting story, but researchers are definitely investigating links between global warming and the spread of Lyme in people and in dogs as well. Another emerging tick-borne disease of dogs in the US is one called Babesia. Babesia is pretty well known in tropical climates and other parts of the world, but the tick vectors that are responsible for the spread and even the limits of where Babesia is endemic is common in dogs in the US is still a pretty open question. The impact that the spread of these ticks then might have on Babesia distribution in the US is pretty unknown, but certainly the contribution of climate change could be really important. We know for the Lone Star tick, it certainly is. And my personal experience with this disease, again, when I was in North Carolina, we used to see Babesia a lot. There were a lot of cases, and here in North Carolina, here in Wisconsin, it's pretty rare. But that anecdotal experience has actually led to a study in my lab. So we're working with some of the clinical pathologists at the vet hospital here, as well as another veterinary internist, to systematically test dogs coming in through the UW Vet Hospital for Babesia exposure to see if there's any evidence that it's transmitting in Wisconsin. And that will really help us, if we find it, great. Even if we don't find it, it will be really helpful as a point in time to say, yeah, we looked really systematically and it is not here. So that if we do find it at some point in the future, it's good evidence that that's caused by the spread of the tick into new locations. All right, for our last vector, moving away from ticks and onto my favorite disease vector, which is the flea. We know that fleas can and often do survive all year in all kinds of habitats and environments by living entirely indoors. They can exist generation after generation, week after week, month after month, year after year, without ever leaving the comfort of the carpet in your apartment. But they also do have some dependence on climate and the environment, particularly relevant for pets that spend time outdoors. And this is also relevant for the wildlife species that live in our neighborhoods, backyards, crawl spaces, and sometimes inside of our houses, and therefore might actually share some fleas with our pets. So we know that fleas survive much better when temperatures are mild. When it's over about 45 degrees outside, fleas can live for about 3 weeks. So when we have mild winters, or even when there's warm spells within an otherwise colder winter, fleas can thrive and reproduce outdoors, serving as a reservoir for flea infestation in our pets when we might least expect it. So with more fleas on our pets, more exposure of our pets to fleas, and the fleas that are on our pets being more active, comes an associated risk of flea-borne disease. Particularly the one that I worry about is Bartonella. Bartonella is the bacteria that causes cat scratch disease, amongst many other problems. And it's also the disease that I study mostly in my research. But fleas can also carry other pathogens like rickettsia and even tapeworms. So I did mention at the beginning that I would spend a few minutes on the impacts of climate change on pets that aren't infectious diseases, and there are some to be aware of. With temperatures climbing in the summers and Wisconsin getting warmer, as you can see from the map I put up, we do have to be aware of heat stress and heat stroke in our dogs. This is something that I know pet owners are aware of in places that are traditionally extremely hot and humid. But definitely it's becoming more of an issue even here in Wisconsin. This came up just last month. We had a case in the hospital of suspected heat stroke, and really nobody was expecting to see that in June. It typically hadn't been hot enough to really see heat stroke in dogs. And it was a strong reminder that the things that we might have been able to do with our pets 20 years ago, we might not be able to do safely anymore because of the heat. Fortunately, there are prevention strategies we can take. So preventing heat stroke, we don't want to leave our dogs in the car. If we do have dogs spending time outdoors, we want to make sure they have plenty of access to fresh, clean water, like this very happy black lab in its pool. And also that we are pouring out this water so it doesn't serve as a source for mosquitoes, and cleaning it so it doesn't serve as a source for waterborne disease. But these strategies, we can really help prevent heat stroke even in dogs that do want to go outside. We also need to be really aware of our brachycephalic dogs, our flat-faced dogs. While they're really cute, they have not been bred for hot climates, and their cute flat faces don't let them dissipate heat as well through breathing, which is how dogs dissipate heat. So if you do have a cute flat-faced dog, it's probably best to leave them inside in the air conditioning in the summer still. And then in addition to the risk for dogs getting sick purely because it is hot outside, we also have to be aware of the interplay between the host and the pathogen. You thought I left infectious disease behind, but I'll bring it up again. Heat stress might actually put animals at risk for other types of infectious diseases. And then there are other impacts as well, where the effect of limiting outdoor time can impact dogs' quality of life, or conversely, for pets who aren't so lucky as to have owners who can keep them inside in air conditioning, they might suffer from the heat, the storms, the extreme weather that they have to survive if they're living outdoors in this changing climate. Speaking of extreme weather, this here is a photo of the companion animal shelter trailer. This is a trailer that is designed to take care of people's pets when they have to evacuate to a shelter for this one was for a hurricane. This is in North Carolina. This is a picture I took while volunteering to help take care of these pets in the shelter following Hurricane Florence that affected North Carolina in 2018. So obviously storms that destroy people's whole homes have impacts on their pets. And then when people are forced to migrate permanently, these impacts can be even more stark. And I think it does really point out the need for such an infrastructure for these sort of sources of support for people that are displaced by climate emergencies, such that they can bring their pets with them. I can imagine I too would be much less likely to evacuate if I was going to have to leave my pets behind. Then finally, one impact that's a little bit tangential to climate change, but certainly wrapped up with some of the changes that we're seeing, and that is globalization and the increase in human migration in response to climate emergencies and the changing climate. And this can play out in a few ways. So one, like what's shown on the map on the left, is when new vectors for disease are accidentally imported. This is a map of the locations where the Asian longhorn tick, Haemaphysalis longicornis, has been reported in the US after its introduction in 2017. And then in red, you'll see the areas where it's expected to be able to spread and survive and thrive in the US based on our current climate. So this tick had not been here before, and now we're expecting it to be prevalent even up into Wisconsin. Then finally, disease distribution can also be really altered with the globalization of adoption practices in dogs. You know, it's great that dogs are being rescued out of bad situations. When they're transported internationally or even within the US, we really need to make sure they're not spreading new or emerging diseases. There's a huge need to put guidelines in place to prevent the spread of non-endemic disease to new locations to facilitate the safety of these otherwise like really great adoption practices. So with that fairly depressing and or terrifying list of problems, depending on your worldview, what can we do? So I'm not here to talk about the huge topic of the ways that we as individuals and as a larger society are responsible for mitigating the effects of climate change. I'm going to leave that to other talks and people with more expertise than I have. But I can tell you what I do myself and what I recommend to my clients for their pets to protect them, particularly from the vector-borne disease side of things. Fortunately, there are a ton of easily available, really great preventatives out there. So I recommend that all cats and dogs, whether indoor only or particularly if they spend time outdoors, receive year-round preventatives. That includes prevention against fleas and ticks, plus heartworm, plus intestinal parasites. And yes, that's what I do for my dog and cat year-round, all the time. With a lot of the newer products, there's options for everyone. There's pills, there's collars, there's squirt-ons, there's things that last for as short as 1 month and as long as a year. And so lots of different options to fit everybody. So something definitely to talk to your vet about. So as we know, things are changing fast here in Wisconsin, and there are emerging vector-borne diseases and vectors that we didn't have to worry about with the colder, longer winters 20 or 30 years ago. Fortunately, we have fairly easy ways to prevent these diseases in our dogs and cats. If you are interested in learning more about any of these things that I've briefly touched on, there's a ton of good books and resources out there. This is not by any means a comprehensive list, but just some good places to start if you're thinking about climate change, infectious disease, interface between human health, pet health, and the health of the environment we all share. I'll put up my contact information here, and you can find my bio online too. So if you do have questions that come up either now or after the live version airs, feel free to get in touch with me. And with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing and I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to talk about cows.
Thanks so much, Erin. So we're going to shift gears now and talk about cows. Even if you don't have cows at home, hopefully this is something you're interested in, given that Wisconsin is America's dairy land, as it says on our license plates. And I am not a vet. My training is in animal behavior, so I focus on promoting animal welfare through an evolutionary lens of understanding the cow's natural behavior. So I want to start with a recent news headline that I think was very unfortunate, but very timely, given that this talk was already scheduled. So in mid-June, there was a heat wave that went through the Midwest, and there were several headlines alluding to this particular event where thousands of cattle died in Kansas. And in this case, it was beef cattle. But unfortunately, although this type of event that kills thousands of animals is relatively rare, this is not just a one-off. So here's a similar headline from 5 years ago. In this particular instance, it was dairy cows in California rather than beef cattle. But again, there was a heat wave that caused mass fatalities. And again, this is unfortunately nothing new. So here's an article I pulled from 2009, and this was a retrospective report on a heat wave in 2006 that went across the Southwest. And in California alone, tens of thousands of dairy cattle and other types of livestock and poultry perished. So why is this happening? I think it's a problem that is directly related to climate change and something we need to be aware of. But this phenomenon of heat stress affecting cattle and other livestock is not new. It's just that it's becoming more and more of a prominent issue and more widespread in light of climate change. So I specialize on dairy cattle. And for dairy cattle in particular, it's important to understand why they are so vulnerable to heat stress. And that's because adult cows, particularly lactating ones, generate a great deal of body heat. So this is a slide borrowed from my colleague, Dr. Nigel Cook with the UW-Madison vet school. And what he's showing in this graph is that an adult human at rest is producing body heat, but it's an order of magnitude greater for a cow producing 40 pounds of milk. And so for your reference, a gallon of milk weighs about 8.5 pounds. And in 2022, a cow producing 40 pounds would be considered low producing. So this would be a cow at the end of her lactation or in a relatively low producing setting, such as cows on pasture, say in New Zealand. But on the left, you can see that a cow producing 120 pounds of milk a day, so about 9 gallons, I'm sorry, I did that math wrong. But in any case, a cow producing 120 pounds of milk is producing twice as much heat as that lower producing cow. So essentially, you can think of a dairy cow as a metabolic athlete. Her body is working extremely hard and generating a lot of body heat because she is lactating. And even if a cow isn't producing milk, she generates a great deal of body heat because the way that cows digest their food is through a process called ruminal fermentation, and that generates a lot of heat. So because cows generate a lot of body heat and they're more vulnerable to heat stress, there's this index that's very familiar to dairy farmers already called the temperature humidity index. So this is adapted from an index that was created for humans, but we categorize the ranges of temperature humidity index, or THI, as it's often abbreviated, to reflect the fact that cows are more sensitive. So you can see across the top, there's the relative humidity, and across the side is the air temperature in degrees Fahrenheit. And then you look at the intersection, and that gives you the calculation for the THI. So many studies have shown that milk production begins to decrease at relatively low levels of temperature humidity index. So older studies suggested this happened at a THI of 72, and more recent studies suggest it happens at a THI of 68. So for your reference, if it was 75 degrees outside with low humidity, say 20%, that would already be a THI of 68, even though that's a comfortable temperature for most humans. Cows are already losing milk production because they're suffering from heat stress. And if it's a relatively high humidity day, say 80 or 90%, then even at an air temperature of 69 degrees, we've already achieved a THI of 68. So I've adapted this chart from existing ones, and I've color-coded the categories of THI. So you can see that the pink shading starts at a THI of 68 because that's when milk production tends to drop on average, but I've started the chart lower. So historically, charts didn't even show these lower levels of THI. But as an extension specialist in animal welfare, I think it's really important to think from the cow's perspective, because by the time milk production decreases, it means she's gone through this cascade of physiological responses to heat stress, and she's already experiencing discomfort, which from an ethical perspective, we would like to minimize. So I do want to note that because milk production is affected by heat stress, there are a number of economic models that estimate the economic losses to heat stress for the dairy industry, including reductions in milk production and other relevant things like fertility losses. But because my focus is on animal welfare and alleviating the discomfort to the animals, I'm not going to focus on the economic ramifications in this presentation. So like other mammal, cows are what we call homeotherms. So that means that they need to maintain their core body temperature within a certain relatively narrow range to perform normal bodily function. So it's the same for humans, it's the same for our pets, but that precise temperature range is different for cows. So in order for cows to maintain their body temperature in a normal range, they have to balance the body heat that they produce, which is shown on the left, as well as the heat that they gain from the environment. So this is heat they produce, heat that they're taking in. So they need to then release heat back to the environment to maintain a normal body temperature. So cows show this progression or cascade of natural coping mechanisms to try to avoid producing or gaining excess body heat and to release excess body heat. So On the left side, in terms of avoiding gaining additional heat, cows will naturally seek out shade. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment. And they'll also do things to avoid producing body heat. So when it's hot out, you'll see a reduction in general activity. Cows will become more lethargic. They'll reduce the different behaviors they show. And this is to conserve energy and avoid producing heat. They will also eat less. And again, this is because when they digest, the process of ruminal fermentation generates a lot of heat. So they'll eat less to avoid producing more body heat. And then as a consequence, partially of eating less and partially due to other physiological functions, milk production drops as a consequence. And so this is in part why there are huge economic ramifications of hot weather. So then on the right side, cows also have mechanisms to release body heat. So vasodilation refers to the expansion of the blood vessels, and this helps direct blood flow away from the body's core towards the surface to help cows release heat to the environment. They also have an increase in sweating. So cows do sweat, unlike some animals, but it is not as effective as, say, sweating in horses, which is a major mechanism for that species. As Erin alluded to in her talk, cows also dissipate heat through breathing. So we'll see an increase in their breathing rate or respiratory rate, and that can often escalate to panting. So just like in our dogs, cows will breathe with their mouths open and their tongues hanging out to try to exchange heat to the environment that way. And lastly, they'll seek out sources of water. So similar to dogs, cows will enjoy wallowing in a pond if they have access, but otherwise they'll increase their consumption of drinking water or even just stand near the water trough to try to seek out a slightly cooler microclimate near that water source, or even to splash themselves. One thing to note is that there is unfortunately a natural limit to how effective this suite of coping mechanisms is. So because we've selected dairy cows over the last few decades to produce such high quantities of milk, they produce a great deal of body heat. So when the weather is quite hot, they can't balance out heat gain and heat production with their ability to release heat to the environment. And so that means we need to help our cows out. So this, again, is not a new concept. Heat stress is something that has affected the dairy industry for some time, but it's becoming more of a concern in light of climate change because average temperatures are increasing. So as Erin showed, temperatures have already increased compared to historical averages in Wisconsin. And in addition to rising average temperatures, the frequency of heat waves has increased, as we saw last month, especially with that example from the beef cattle deaths in Kansas. And we also experienced that here in Wisconsin. So what can we do to help our dairy cows cope with heat stress? So there's three main strategies. I'm just going to talk through the first two briefly because that's not my area of expertise. But the first is through genetic selection. So we select cows for many different attributes, including milk production, but also characteristics that have to do with health or well-being. So there are some strategies such as crossbreeding, and in the US, the most common breed is the Holsteins. That's the black and white cows you see on my background, but there are also breeds that are specialized for tropical climates, and they have a different sort of phenotype. They look different from Holsteins, very different. So you can crossbreed them to make them more adaptable to the heat, but then that comes at the expense of milk production. Another strategy is to select for specific genes. So there's one called the slit coat that's present in these tropical breeds, but now with new technology such as gene editing, you can have that gene that helps with the cow's ability to adapt to heat stress without this production loss associated with it. So there are some breeding and genetic strategies that can help the cows be more resilient in the face of this environmental challenge. A second type of strategy is to change the way we feed the cows. So usually cows are fed maybe twice a day with feed pushed up in between. We call it being pushed up because as they feed, the feed becomes scattered, and so it needs to be brought back closer to them. And that's typically during the daytime hours. And so one strategy in the summer that some farms use is to change the timing of feeding. So they'll deliver feed maybe overnight, and that way the cows can eat while it's cooler outside rather than gaining heat from the environment while they're producing heat while they're digesting. Another strategy is to change the composition of the diet. So to change the nutrient profile of what's fed to the cows to avoid having them produce so much heat, so much body heat. But again, this is outside of my area of expertise, so these are well-researched strategies. But what I primarily focus on is this third strategy, which is to modify the cow's housing environment. So I'm going to talk about three main categories of cooling. There are a lot of other strategies in addition to these three, but I think these are the most effective or most relevant for our climate. So providing shade is the #1 most important strategy. It's the first line of defense. And that's because when cows are unshaded, they then gain heat not only from high ambient temperatures and high relative humidity, but also directly from the sun. So they gain from solar radiation. So shade is absolutely critical. And in our region here in Wisconsin, it's pretty much the standard. When cows are housed in a barn, they have shade from the roof of the building. That we do have a decent percentage of cows housed on pasture. And in that case, it's really important that they have access either to shade from trees or from man-made structures, such as shade structure or shade cloth, because again, any other thing you do will be counteracted by the heat that is gained from the sun. And this takes advantage of the cow's natural inclination to seek shelter from the sun. So it's an adaptive behavior. It's one of the first things cows will do when the temperature increases is to seek out an area of shade. So what I'm showing here is a photo that my PhD student Kim Reuscher took at our research facility in Arlington, Wisconsin, but that's paired with a graph from a study from Canada. So in this particular study, cows were housed in a barn, but they had a gate that was open and the cows could freely decide whether or not they wanted to go out onto an adjoining pasture. And what the study found was that cows spent time in both environments throughout the day. So what you can see in the graph is time of day on the x-axis and then the percent of time they spent on pasture during any given hour. And so what we can see is that their preference for pasture or spending time in the barn depended on both the time of the day and the weather conditions. And so this is showing that actually during the daytime hours, cows spent most of their time inside the barn. And I should note, they were provided with feed inside the barn. And then they spent almost all of their time outside on the pasture at night. And that was as long as it wasn't raining. So if it was raining, they sought shelter in the barn even overnight. And the other important thing to note is that cows not only sought shelter from rain, but also from the sun. So as the temperature humidity index, or THI, increased, cows' preference for spending time inside the barn during the daytime also increased. So they spent less and less time on pasture. So this told us that there are important attributes of both environments for the cows, and their preference really depended on the context. And so in this picture that Kim took, this is what we call our dry cow facility. So this is when cows are no longer lactating, they're getting ready to give birth to their next calf and they have a break. And so this is a similar type of setup as in the Canadian study. So our cows have access to a barn with feed inside, but they can freely decide whether or not to go out on pasture during the summer. So in this example, you can see some cows are on their way out, but a lot of their other cohorts are inside in the barn. So there are other studies that have illustrated how much cows care about shade and why it's so important to give it to them. So in this study, this was actually done in New Zealand with pastured cows. They were trained in a testing scenario and then tested to see what their preferences were. So there were 3 options, and they chose between 2 at a time repeatedly so that the researchers could quantify the preferences. So one was a shade structure cows could stand under 1 at a time. One was an area of the same size with no shade, so they were directly exposed to the sun. And then in the last choice, the cows had sprinklers, which I'll talk about next, which provide cooling, but no shade. So sprinklers help them dissipate heat, similar to sweating, but then the sun would still cause them to gain heat. And what the researchers found was that cows preferred being in the shade compared to being in the sun, even if they had sprinklers available. And when the cows did choose the sprinklers, actually those sprinklers caused more cooling based on the cow's thermoregulatory responses compared to just the shade, but nonetheless, the cows strongly preferred the shade. So this shows that it's really important to understand cows' natural behavior and what they prefer so that we can design housing environments appropriately. And in this case, cows had to face a trade-off. So they could either have shade or sprinklers with no shade. And so during my PhD in California, I conducted a follow-up study. So this time we removed that trade-off and cows could choose this combination of cooling resources. So there was a feeding area in the pen where there was just shade overhead, or an identical feeding area with shade and sprinklers underneath. And so in this case, when cows had access to both resources simultaneously, they showed a clear preference for the combination of sprinklers and shade, which caused them to be able to cool down more effectively. So sprinklers are very effective, especially when they're combined with shade. And this is the second strategy for cooling cows, but there are some important limitations. So the first relates to environmental sustainability, which is that in some regions of the US, particularly out west or in the Southwest, access to potable water is limited. And this is further threatened by climate change. So with climate change, models have predicted changes in precipitation patterns. So rainfall is going to become more unpredictable, and not only rainfall, but also snowpack, which is really critical out west because when that snowpack melts during the warm season, that's what provides an important source of water. So related to this point, there are a lot of different uses for potable water on dairy farms. The number one highest use is related to milking. So this is things like cleaning the cows themselves, cleaning the parlor, and equipment related to milking. And there is a wide range across facilities, but that's the top use. And then cooling cows with soakers or sprinklers also uses a substantial amount of water, although again, there's wide variation in how much farms use, if they use sprinklers at all. And then there's the drinking water for the cows themselves, which is not as high of a use, but it's also important. And this is also concerning in the context of climate change because we've seen that droughts have become more common and more severe. So during my PhD at UC Davis, we had a multi-year historical drought. And at one point, none of the state had the status of no drought. So you can see it ranged from moderate drought to exceptional drought. And so this was really concerning since we needed access to potable water, again, for the cows themselves to drink, as well as to help alleviate heat stress and for normal milking operations. And so this led to this question about how do we face these trade-offs in terms of animal welfare and helping cows cope with the heat, as well as preventing these economic losses relating to milk production, decreasing in heat stress, but also balancing that with judicious water use. So that was the topic of my PhD. And another limitation of using soakers for cooling cows is that although soakers are very effective for alleviating many aspects of heat stress and cooling the cows, restoring milk production, restoring their eating, it does not improve cows' resting times in hot weather. So cows are different from some other species. For them, resting behavior is extremely important. So normally adult dairy cows housed in a barn will spend about half of their day or more lying down and resting. And study after study has shown that as the THI or as the air temperature increases, resting time decreases. And this is even when cows have access to soakers that help restore their eating behavior and their milk yield. So even though soakers are very effective at alleviating heat stress, cows will naturally still spend more time standing up to try to dissipate heat. And so this is concerning because when cows spend too much time standing up, especially on concrete, instead of lying down and resting, this can lead to risk for certain diseases, including impairing their ability to walk. Actually, it can lead to damage to the hoofs and to their legs. So I want to talk just really briefly about a study that we did in 2020 that was led by my PhD student, Kim Reuscher, who introduced us at the beginning. This is part of her dissertation, and it's in collaboration with Dr. Nigel Cook from the vet school. We received funding from the USDA to carry out a series of studies, as well as some extension activities I'll mention. And she was looking at the effects of properly mounted and calibrated fans on heat stress responses, particularly resting time, because no study has ever found that we've been able to restore resting time with strategies such as cooling cows with soakers. And this might seem like common sense. You may have seen in the beginning when Kim introduced us, she had a fan in the background. It's something that we as humans intuitively know can help cool us down. But the analogy I like to use is if you walk into someone's home and see that they have a treadmill, you can't infer that the residents of the house are physically fit. You have to know, is the treadmill working and is it used effectively? So similarly, if you walk into a dairy barn and you see fans mounted, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's helping the cows in the right way. They have to be spaced properly, angled properly, calibrated to deliver the right speed, and activated when the cows need it. So we were working under some hypotheses that came from engineering models, but this was the first time we actually validated and tested the effect of properly calibrated fans on cows' heat stress responses, especially lying time. So we measured and calibrated the air speeds delivered by the fans at 1.5 feet high, which would hit the cow's broadside when they're lying down, as you can see in this picture. And we were aiming for a minimum airspeed of at least 1 meter per second or more. And what we found was very striking. So not only did properly calibrated fans reduce the cow's heat stress responses, like their respiration rate, their body temperature, and it also promoted milk yield in these hot conditions. This was the first study to show that properly calibrated fans delivering this fast-moving air promoted resting time. So we didn't see this typical decrease in hotter conditions, and resting time stayed stable. So we're really pleased with these results. And I just want to share a couple images that Kim took. So these photos were taken 1 minute apart at 2 p.m. during peak heat of the day in the summer. And on the top photo, you can see the fans are turned off, and only 5 out of 16 cows in this pen were lying down and resting, and the rest were congregated around the water trough, because again, that's a natural behavior of cows where they seek out sources of water when they're feeling overheated. But on the bottom, 14 out of the 16 cows were resting when the fans were turned on, and the other 2 were up at the feeding area eating. So it's just a dramatic illustration of the difference that properly calibrated fans can make. So with the knowledge we gained from this study and a subsequent one that we conducted across private dairy facilities in Wisconsin, we are now sharing this information back to the dairy industry. So we're holding a series of hands-on workshops this summer. So we had one last week, one earlier, and we'll have 2 more, one later this month, one in August. So we're sharing how to assess the performance of barn ventilation systems, as well as how to assess how well the cows themselves are coping. And in terms of the next frontier in the future, we're seeing a lot of potential for what's called precision livestock farming, which uses this concept of biofeedback. So we can use various automated technologies, such as sensors or image analysis, to assess the various responses of cows at the individual level in a less labor-intensive fashion. And so this can include the behavioral responses and physiological responses. And then a system can then incorporate this information to decide when cooling is needed, which cows need it, and then deliver it in a customized fashion. So I'm collaborating on a project sponsored by the NSF with some engineers at UW-Madison to try to explore this next frontier. So the take-home message is that even in the face of a changing climate, we can help cows cope with heat stress through various strategies, including genetic selection, modifying the feeding strategies, and modifying the housing environment. And like Erin, there is another way we can try to address this challenge, but it's really above my pay grade and out of the scope of what I do, which would be to try to mitigate climate change and change not just the housing environment, but the overall environment. So in closing, I just wanted to share my contact information, and you're welcome to reach out, but at this time, I'd be happy to take any live questions.
Great, Jennifer and Erin, thank you so much for presenting this important information. And we do have some comments in the chat. Thank you for focusing on animal welfare, that it's really not something you hear often about. So, well, you probably do, but we don't. So I want to thank you for that. We do have a couple of questions, and I know we have to hard stop at noon, so I'm being aware of time, but I'm going to ask the glass half full question, because a lot of this is, of course, concerning news. Is there anything with the changing climate that is maybe a positive impact at all on any of the, with animals, with pets in your work? Has there been any like positively good note?
I mean, I think from my perspective, I don't know, maybe this is sort of avoiding the question, but the way that I stay optimistic, I suppose, is recognizing that, like, for all of the harm that people have done in the world, there's equivalent and hopefully more good that we can do, whether it's things like using technology or doing research or, those kinds of things, using these technologies to understand what's going on and to hopefully prevent some of the harm and, change the way that we're living a little bit. I guess that's the good
I'll
part,
take it.
the silver lining.
Thanks for that, Erin. I appreciate it. So let's see. We have a question. What time or / duration of sprinklers are needed to be effective? That's for you, Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So my answer is actually there's no one size fits all solution. I would say a good starting point is that we know there's such a thing as using too little water. So if you're spraying cows in their feeding area, typically it's called a fan nozzle. So it has this kind of pattern that sprays maybe 2 or 3 cows at once while they're eating. And we know you need to apply at least a gallon at a time to this small subset of cows. If you apply less than that, then you're not cooling them effectively, and that's a waste of water. We also know that it takes approximately 15 minutes or less for the water to evaporate from the coat. So you want to spray cows at least every 15 minutes or more frequently, and it would be more frequently in hotter weather because the evaporation happens sooner. But again, it's not one size fits all. So what I really emphasize is checking and calibrating by measuring the cow's responses, because individual animals will respond differently even in the same environment. So you have to ask the cows, how are you faring, and calibrate from there.
Great. And on that same note, is there an increased risk for skin infection with humidity and some of the cooling solutions for both dogs and cows?
I'll answer for cows first. So not that we're aware of in terms of cooling them with soakers, but there is actually a risk cows can get sunburn. So you can see these beautiful black and white cows underneath the white part of their hair, that's pink skin. And so again, this actually goes back to the importance of shade, not only to protect them from the heat stress, but also to protect them from sunburn.
Great, thank you. And Erin, I think this one's for you about frontline. Let's see, is Fipronil an effective preventative for insect vectors, and with longer seasons, is there greater risk for toxicity? Would you know the answer to that one?
Yeah, so I can't off the top of my head, honestly, I'm not sure about specific brands or like components of brands, but I do know that there is sort of a range of effectiveness of different types of preventatives for fleas and ticks. And a lot of it depends on basically how significant the flea burden and the tick burden is. So I think the people, honestly, that know the best about what works in their specific region and location are going to be your vets that are out in practice, because they're the ones seeing pets all the time. But I do honestly think that the biggest time we see a quote unquote failure of our product is when they're applied improperly, or the time in between doses is wrong. So like if you're supposed to be squirting the squirt on every month and you only squirt it on every 6 weeks, like there's some time in between there that it's not actually working. And I'm guilty of that too. Sometimes in the middle of winter, I'm like, I forgot for an extra week and it's been 5 weeks, and that's usually fine because there's so few fleas. But I think with, if you follow the instructions really closely, most of these products are really, really effective. And actually, in May this year, I was part of a study that was looking at the effectiveness of one of the oral flea preventatives in cats. And basically, within a week, the flea populations were decimated. And by 2 weeks, with all of the cats in a home treated, there were no more fleas in those homes. So they are really, really effective.
Great, thank you for that. We do have some posts in the chat from friends who believe that perhaps dairy, cows shouldn't be used for dairy or what have you. And I just want to acknowledge that we value your opinion. However, the topic of this conversation today is about animal welfare, so we're not going to open that can of worms. I just want to acknowledge their questions. Have either of you done any research, though? They do bring up mink farming. Is that anything you all are aware of in terms of, they mention COVID mutations through mink farms? Is that anything either of you have studied?
Not particularly in my own research. I know it has been definitely in the news. Mink are certainly susceptible to SARS-CoV-2 and get infected. So, but yeah, not for me personally.
Okay, great.
My only comment there is my understanding is that Wisconsin is the #1 state in the US for mink production. It's not something I do work on, but I did want to mention that there are researchers worldwide who are doing work on improving the welfare of farmed mink. So that's not a species that I work with, but there are people out there who are trying to improve the lives of mink who are used for that purpose.
Great. Well, thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us today. And I'm excited that we'll have this information available for people to reference later if they want to come back. So thanks so much to both of you for joining us today and kicking off our sustainability series.
Yeah, thank you for hosting.
Great. So Sustainability Month will continue on Badger Talks Live. Next Tuesday, July 19th at noon, we're going to be talking to the Nelson Institute's Tom Eggert, who will be talking about investment opportunities of climate change. Also, please visit us at badgertalks.wis.edu. You can hear the upcoming or the newly released podcast issue where Ben has been talking to some of our sustainability speakers. See the upcoming schedule of live talks on our website, sign up for our email list, and search the roster of over 400 UW faculty and staff who generously donate their time to come into communities like yours to share information and work with communities to try to address issues of concern. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll look forward to seeing you next Tuesday.